You just said that clause guarantees stability, but it actually does the opposite. The sentence didn't rise above a calm tone, yet it cut clean through the low hum of crystal glasses and polite laughter, and for a brief second, no one moved. The dining room of Whitmore House had always been loud in a controlled way, the kind of expensive noise where deals were made between bites of perfectly seared steak and half-finished sentences. But now even the waitstaff paused mid-step, as if the air itself had tightened. Clara Bennett stood beside the long table, a black apron tied neatly at her waist, one hand still resting lightly on a porcelain coffee cup she had just set down. Her posture was straight but unassuming, her expression neutral, almost gentle, as though she had merely corrected the time rather than interrupted a billionaire in front of 8 high-level investors. 20 minutes earlier, the room had felt entirely different. When Daniel Whitmore walked in, conversations shifted without needing to stop. Chairs adjusted. People leaned forward just a little more. He carried the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but expected it. Tailored navy suit, silver watch catching the light with every subtle movement, eyes that scanned the room like he was already calculating outcomes. Clara had noticed him the same way she noticed everything, quietly, without reacting, as she moved between tables balancing a tray of drinks with practiced precision. She didn't rush. She never rushed. That was the first thing people tended to underestimate about her. Daniel had taken his seat at the center, naturally, as if the room had been arranged around him. Within minutes, he was steering the conversation, guiding numbers, adjusting narratives, occasionally dropping half-phrases that sounded impressive but didn't fully land. It wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. A test, though no one had said it out loud. Clara had approached the table twice before the moment happened, once to pour water, once to take a supplemental order. Each time, Daniel barely looked at her, except for a brief glance that lingered just long enough to register her presence as background. But Clara had been listening. Not obviously. Not in a way that drew attention. Just enough. When she returned with the coffee service, the conversation had shifted into something more technical. A discussion about risk allocation, market insulation, words layered over assumptions. Daniel leaned back slightly, fingers tapping once against the table as he delivered his conclusion with quiet confidence. It sounded right. It felt right. And that was the problem. Clara placed the cup down in front of him, the ceramic making the softest sound against the tablecloth. She could have walked away. Most would have. But instead, she paused for just half a second longer than necessary, her eyes flicking briefly to the printed document near his hand, then back to the table. No tension. No hesitation. Just clarity. And then she spoke. Not loudly. Not sharply. Just enough. You just said that clause guarantees stability, but it actually does the opposite. At first, someone let out a small chuckle, assuming it was a misunderstanding. Another guest shifted in their seat, glancing at Daniel as if waiting for him to dismiss it. But Clara didn't move. She didn't backtrack. She didn't apologize. Her hand slid away from the coffee cup, resting calmly at her side. Daniel's fingers stopped tapping. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to her, really looking this time, not at the uniform, but at her eyes. There was no challenge in them. No fear either. Just something far more unsettling. Certainty. The kind that didn't need permission to exist. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore didn't speak immediately. Daniel Whitmore did not react the way most men in his position would have. There was no immediate correction, no sharp dismissal, no laughter to reclaim control of the room. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Clara as if recalibrating something he had misread. Around the table, the others shifted in their seats, the earlier confidence dissolving into quiet curiosity. One of the investors cleared his throat softly, glancing between Daniel and the printed document as if unsure which version of reality to follow. Clara did not rush to explain herself. She did not fill the silence. She simply stood there, composed, as though she had already said everything necessary. Daniel's fingers moved again, but this time not in rhythm. He reached for the document, sliding it closer, his eyes scanning the exact line she had indirectly pointed to. The clause sat there in clean, precise language, polished and confident, just like everything else in the room. And yet, now that it had been named, something about it felt off. Explain, Daniel said finally, his voice lower than before, not louder, not aggressive, just focused. It was the first real invitation he had given her. A few guests exchanged quick glances. This was no longer a joke. Clara nodded once, barely noticeable, and stepped half an inch closer to the table, not enough to intrude, just enough to be heard clearly. The structure assumes the risk is distributed evenly across all parties, she said, her tone steady, measured, the kind of voice that did not try to impress, only to clarify. But the trigger condition shifts the burden entirely to your side if the market dips below the threshold by even 1%. She paused, not for effect, but because the sentence had reached its natural end. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. That is standard language. One of the guests interjected quickly, almost defensively. Clara turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression unchanged. It is standard, she agreed. But the timing window here is shortened. That changes the exposure. She did not raise her voice. She did not emphasize the correction. She simply placed it there, like a piece that had always belonged but had been overlooked. The man who had spoken opened his mouth again, then stopped. He looked back down at the page, this time more carefully. Across the table, another investor leaned in, tracing the paragraph with his finger. The room began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, quiet adjustments. Chairs moved closer. Eyes focused. Assumptions loosened. Daniel remained still, absorbing it all. For a moment, the power in the room did not belong to the one who had spoken the most, but to the one who had spoken last. If that is true, Daniel said slowly, then the downside is not just increased. It is concentrated. Clara met his gaze, not challenging, not yielding. Yes, sir. No elaboration. No need. The words settled over the table like a weight that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to acknowledge first. One of the senior partners exhaled quietly, leaning back in his chair. She is right, he said, almost reluctantly. The sentence landed heavier than any argument. Daniel did not look away from Clara. Not this time. Not even for a second. There was something different in his expression now, something stripped of assumption, something closer to recognition. He glanced once more at the document. Then back at her. What is your name? He asked. It was not a courtesy. It was a recalibration. Clara Bennett, she replied. Just a name. No explanation attached. Daniel repeated it once under his breath, as if committing it to memory. Around them, the room remained unusually quiet, but it was no longer the silence of interruption. It was the silence of people realizing they had almost missed something important. Clara gave a small, polite nod, the kind that signaled the end of an interaction, and reached for the empty cup to clear it away. For everyone else, the moment felt like an interruption. For her, it was simply part of the job. And as she turned a step away, the conversation did not immediately resume. Because for the first time that night, no one was entirely sure who had been in control all along. Clara walked away without looking back, her steps steady, unhurried, the same measured rhythm she had carried all evening. But behind her, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The conversation at the table did not resume immediately, and when it did, it sounded different, more careful, as if every word now had to pass through a second layer of thought before being spoken. Daniel Whitmore remained seated, his attention no longer on the people across from him, but on the document still resting beneath his hand. He read the clause again, slower this time, tracing the structure not as a presentation, but as a problem. The confidence he had displayed earlier had not disappeared, but it had been interrupted, and that interruption lingered. One of the senior investors leaned forward, lowering his voice. We should revisit the risk allocation before moving forward, he said, choosing his words with unusual caution. Daniel did not respond right away. His eyes lifted slightly, following the direction Clara had gone, though she was no longer in view, already absorbed back into the quiet flow of service. For a brief moment, the room felt divided between what had been assumed and what had just been revealed. Then Daniel closed the folder gently, not with frustration, not with finality, but with a kind of deliberate pause. We will take 10 minutes, he said, his tone calm, controlled, but different now, less about command and more about consideration. The group nodded, some relieved, others unsettled, but none dismissive. As chairs shifted and quiet side conversations began, Daniel remained still for another second longer than necessary. Then he stood, not abruptly, Not dramatically, just enough to signal a change in direction. Across the dining room, Clara was resetting another table, aligning silverware with quiet precision, adjusting a napkin so it sat perfectly parallel to the edge. She did not look toward him. She did not need to. Daniel approached slowly, not as a man reclaiming authority, but as someone stepping into unfamiliar ground. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, his presence noticeable but not overwhelming. "Clara," he said, her name now carrying weight, not curiosity. She turned, meeting his gaze with the same calm expression, as if nothing significant had just occurred. "Yes, sir." The title was polite, but neutral, stripped of any hierarchy beyond the moment itself. Daniel studied her for a second, longer than before, as though trying to place something that did not fit into any of his usual categories. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. It was a simple question, but not a casual one. Clara tilted her head slightly, not evasive, just thoughtful. "I read," she said. No elaboration. No defense. Just a quiet answer that closed more doors than it opened. Daniel almost smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition. He had built an entire career on identifying gaps, patterns, overlooked details, and now he was standing in front of one. "That was not just reading," he said, his voice softer now, more measured. Clara held his gaze for a moment, then glanced briefly toward the table he had left behind, where the conversation was still unfolding without him. "They are waiting for you," she said gently, not dismissing him, but redirecting him. Daniel followed her glance, then looked back at her, something unspoken passing between them. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity, or both. "Yes," he said quietly, but he did not move immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a pen, and without ceremony, he slid the document from under his arm and made a small notation in the margin, right beside the clause she had corrected. A single mark. Precise. Intentional. Then he closed the folder again. When he looked back up, Clara had already turned away, continuing her work as if the moment had dissolved the second it ended. Daniel stood there for one brief second longer, then exhaled softly and returned to the table. This time, when he sat down, he did not begin by speaking. He began by listening. And for the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the room was not the one controlling the conversation, but the one willing to change it. When Daniel Whitmore began speaking again, the room adjusted to him out of habit, but something subtle had changed, something almost invisible unless you were paying attention. His voice was still calm, still controlled, but the certainty that had once filled every sentence had been replaced with something more deliberate, more precise. He did not rush to reassert dominance. He did not dismiss what had happened. Instead, he opened the folder once more and turned it toward the group, his finger resting lightly beside the same clause Clara had corrected. "Let us walk through this again," he said, not as a command, but as a recalibration. The shift was immediate. The investors leaned in, no longer nodding automatically, no longer following blindly. Now they questioned. Now they checked. Numbers were repeated. Assumptions were tested. The room, once guided by one voice, had become a space of careful analysis. Across the dining room, Clara continued her work, moving between tables with the same quiet rhythm, but now, occasionally, someone would glance in her direction, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. The kind that lingers after something important has been revealed. Daniel noticed it too. Not directly, not in a way that showed, but in the small pauses between his sentences, in the way his eyes briefly lifted before returning to the discussion. He was not distracted. He was aware. "If we adjust the trigger condition," one of the partners suggested, his tone more cautious now, "we can redistribute the exposure without compromising the upside." Daniel nodded slightly, considering it. Before, he might have answered immediately, shaped the idea into his own, controlled the outcome. But now, he let the silence sit for a moment longer, giving the thought space to exist on its own. "Run the numbers," he said finally. Conservatively. It was a simple instruction, but it carried a different weight. Not assumption. Verification. The group moved quickly, tablets lighting up, calculations unfolding in real time. A few minutes passed, quiet but focused, the kind of silence that builds something rather than hides it. Then one of the analysts looked up, his expression shifting from concentration to something closer to surprise. "The margin holds," he said. and the downside is reduced by almost 12%. A few heads turned. Another analyst double-checked, then nodded. He is right. Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing it, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The correction had not just fixed a detail. It had changed the direction. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood the implication. A single overlooked line had nearly tilted the entire deal. And a single voice, the quietest one in the room, had stopped it. Daniel closed the folder again, this time with a different kind of finality. Not the end of a discussion, but the end of an assumption. We proceed with the adjustment, he said. No hesitation, no resistance, just decision. The group nodded, more unified now, but also more aware. The deal was still his. The room still moved with him. But something fundamental had shifted beneath it. As the meeting transitioned into quieter conversations and closing remarks, Daniel's attention drifted once more across the room. Clara was at the far end now, refilling a glass, her movements as steady as before, untouched by the ripple she had created. She did not look toward him. She did not need acknowledgement. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Not because he felt challenged, but because he recognized something he could not control. When the final signatures were discussed, and the tone softened into polite closure, Daniel remained composed. But his mind was no longer entirely on the deal. It returned, again and again, to a single moment. A single sentence. A quiet correction that had changed everything without asking permission. As the guests began to stand and gather their belongings, one of the senior investors paused beside him and spoke in a low voice. You should find out who she really is. Daniel did not respond immediately. His gaze moved once more across the room, settling briefly on Clara before she disappeared into the back hallway. Then he exhaled, slow, thoughtful. I intend to, he said. And for the first time that evening, it was not curiosity that drove him. It was respect. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm it had been before, not quite as effortless, not quite as certain, as if something invisible had been rearranged beneath the surface and no one could fully ignore it. Coats were lifted from chair backs, quiet handshakes exchanged, voices softened into polite conclusions. But even as the evening wrapped itself neatly back into form, there was a lingering awareness that the most important moment had not been part of the plan. Daniel Whitmore stood among them, composed as always, acknowledging each partner with the same controlled presence, yet his attention was no longer anchored to the room itself. It drifted, subtly but persistently, toward the hallway where Clara had disappeared. He did not follow immediately. He did not excuse himself abruptly. That was not his way. Instead, he completed every expected interaction, every closing remark, every final detail of the evening, but each one carried a slight delay, a fraction of a second where his focus slipped somewhere else. When the last guest finally departed and the dining room settled into a quieter state, the absence of conversation felt different now, not empty, but reflective. Daniel remained standing near the table for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair he had occupied, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Then, without urgency, he turned and walked toward the back corridor. The noise of the main dining area faded behind him, replaced by the softer, more functional sounds of the restaurant, dishes being cleared, low voices exchanging instructions, the steady rhythm of work continuing without ceremony. Clara was near the service station, organizing a stack of plates with the same precision she had shown all evening, aligning each one as if the smallest detail still mattered, even when no one was watching. She sensed him before she saw him, not because of the sound, but because of the shift in space, the subtle presence that carried expectation with it. She finished placing the last plate before turning. Mr. Whitmore, she said, her tone even, neither surprised nor impressed. Just aware. Daniel stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to respect the boundary she had never asked for but clearly maintained. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply looked at her, not with the detached assessment he had used earlier in the evening, but with something more focused, more intentional. You changed the outcome of that deal, he said finally, his voice calm, stripped of performance. Clara shook her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. No, she replied. I corrected a line. The distinction was subtle, but absolute. Daniel exhaled softly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. Most people would not have said anything, he said. Clara met his gaze, her expression unchanged. Most people were not listening, she answered. There was no pride in her voice. No challenge. Just fact. Daniel considered that, letting the words settle without interruption. In his world, people spoke often, loudly, confidently, but listening, real listening, was rare, and even rarer from those who were expected to remain invisible. Where did you learn to see it that way? He asked again, this time not as a test, but as a genuine question. Clara paused for a brief moment, her eyes shifting slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if measuring how much of an answer was necessary. I used to work in a place where mistakes like that cost more than money, she said. It was the first time she had offered something beyond the surface. Still incomplete, still controlled, but real. Daniel studied her more closely now, the pieces beginning to align, not fully, but enough to understand that the role she held here was not the full story. And now you work here, he said, not as a question, but as an observation that carried its own weight. Clara nodded once. For now. 2 words. Open-ended. Final. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was measured, like everything else between them. Then Daniel reached into his jacket again, pulling out a card, simple, understated, expensive without needing to show it. He held it for a moment, then extended it toward her. If you ever decide that for now should change, he said, call me. Clara looked at the card, then at him, her expression softening just slightly, not into a smile, but into something quieter. Understanding, perhaps. She took the card without hesitation, without gratitude, without resistance. Just acceptance. I will consider it, she said. Not a promise. Not a refusal. Just truth. Daniel gave a small nod, the kind reserved for equals, not employees, and turned to leave. He did not look back this time. He did not need to. Behind him, Clara slipped the card into the pocket of her apron and returned to her work, aligning another set of plates, her movements unchanged, her presence just as quiet as before. But the room, even in its calm, would not forget what had happened. And neither would he. The night did not end when Daniel Whitmore walked out of the restaurant. It simply changed locations. The city outside carried its usual rhythm, headlights stretching into long reflections across wet pavement, distant horns blending into a steady hum, the kind of background noise that never fully disappears. Inside the back office, however, it was quiet. Clara sat alone at a small desk, the overhead light casting a soft glow over a stack of receipts and a worn notebook resting beside them. Her apron was folded neatly on the chair next to her, the fabric still holding the faint scent of coffee and polished wood. For a moment, she did nothing, just sat there, fingers resting lightly against the edge of the notebook, her gaze unfocused, as if replaying something she did not need to see again. Then, slowly, she reached into the pocket of the apron and pulled out the card Daniel had given her. It was heavier than it looked. Clean. Minimal. His name embossed in quiet authority. She turned it once between her fingers, then set it down on the desk without examining it further. Not hesitation. Not dismissal. Just control. Across town, Daniel was not home. The car had dropped him off at his office without needing instruction, the driver understanding his patterns well enough to anticipate them. The building was mostly dark, only a few floors still lit, the kind of silence that belonged to people who worked beyond the expectation of hours. Daniel stood near the window of his office, looking out over the city, his reflection faint against the glass. His jacket was off, draped over the back of a chair, his tie loosened just enough to suggest the day had shifted, but not ended. On his desk, the same folder lay open, the corrected clause marked clearly in his handwriting. He had reviewed it 3 times already. Not because he doubted the change, but because he wanted to understand how he had missed it. That question stayed with him longer than the correction itself. He had built an entire career on precision, on seeing what others overlooked, on staying 3 steps ahead of every possible variable. And yet, tonight, a waitress had seen something he had not. The thought did not frustrate him. It focused him. He picked up his phone, hesitated for half a second, then set it back down. This was not something to delegate. Not yet. Back in the restaurant, Clara opened her notebook. The pages were filled with small, Neat handwriting, numbers, notes, fragments of analysis that did not belong to a service job, but to something far more complex. She flipped through a few pages, stopping at one that mirrored the structure she had seen earlier that evening. Her pen hovered above the paper for a moment, then began to move, adjusting a figure, rewriting a line, refining a thought that had already been solved. Not because she needed to, but because she could not ignore it. The habit of precision does not disappear. It waits. Daniel finally sat down at his desk, leaning back slightly as he stared at the ceiling for a brief moment, then forward again, his focus narrowing. He reached for the folder once more, but this time, instead of reviewing it, he closed it completely and set it aside. The deal was done. The correction had been made. That was not what mattered now. What mattered was the question that had not been answered. Who was Clara Bennett? And why was she working in a place where her level of awareness went unnoticed until tonight? He stood again, the decision already forming before it was fully spoken. Not impulsive, not emotional, just clear. Somewhere across the city, Clara closed her notebook, the last line complete, the page aligned perfectly with the rest. She placed the pen down, then glanced once more at the card on the desk. This time, she picked it up, turning it slightly, her eyes tracing the name not with curiosity, but with recognition of what it represented. Opportunity, expectation, change. She exhaled softly, then slipped the card back into her bag, not as a commitment, but as a possibility she was not ready to define. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the quiet shift that had begun in two different rooms, carried by two people who understood something most others did not. Power is not always where it appears, and sometimes the ones who see the most are the ones no one is watching. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light stretching across the city as if it had somewhere more important to be. Inside Whitmore Capitol, the building was already awake, screens flickering, quiet conversations threading through glass offices, the low hum of decisions being made before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it, not elevated, not separated, but moving through it with the same controlled presence that defined everything he did. Yet today, his pace was different, not slower, more precise, as if every step had a purpose that extended beyond routine. In the main conference room, a team of analysts sat waiting, tablets open, projections ready, their posture reflecting a mix of confidence and anticipation. This was where Daniel usually operated at his sharpest, where numbers became direction and direction became outcome. He entered without announcement, taking his seat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping briefly across the room before settling on the large display at the front. "Walk me through the revised model," he said, his voice even, without urgency, but impossible to ignore. The lead analyst began immediately, outlining the adjustments made overnight, referencing the same clause that had shifted the deal. The numbers were cleaner now, safer, structured with intention rather than assumption. As the explanation continued, Daniel listened without interruption, his hands still, his expression unreadable. It was not until the analyst finished that he spoke again. "Run the sensitivity at 1% below threshold," he said. A small pause, then again at half. The request was simple, but it changed the room. Fingers moved quickly across screens, recalculations unfolding in real time. A few seconds passed. Then one of the junior analysts looked up, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. "It still holds," he said. Another confirmed it. Then another. The structure was solid. This time, undeniably so. Daniel nodded once, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. The correction had not just fixed the deal. It had strengthened it. He leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting away from the screen, not toward anyone in the room, but somewhere beyond it. "Good," he said quietly. Then, after a brief pause, "Document the change and update the final terms." The team moved to comply, but there was a subtle shift in their attention, a question unspoken but present. Daniel rarely revisited something once he had approved it. Today, he had not just revisited it. He had rebuilt it. As the meeting concluded and the room began to clear, one of the senior managers lingered. "You caught that quickly," he said, a note of respect in his voice. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood, gathering the folder with a measured motion, his eyes briefly scanning the revised document. "No," he he said finally. I did not. The distinction was quiet, but absolute. The manager hesitated, then nodded, understanding more than the words themselves revealed. Across the city, the restaurant was opening for the day, chairs being set, menus aligned, the quiet preparation that existed before the first customer arrived. Clara Bennett stood near the front window, adjusting a small stack of menus so that each edge lined up perfectly. The morning light caught in the glass, reflecting back a version of the room that looked almost untouched, as if the previous night had never happened. But it had, and she knew it. She moved through the space with the same calm precision, but there was a subtle awareness in her posture now. Not tension, not expectation, just readiness. The kind that comes from knowing that something has shifted, even if nothing has been said. As she turned to place the last menu down, her bag shifted slightly against the chair where she had set it. Inside, the card remained, unchanged, waiting. Clara did not reach for it. Not yet. She simply continued her work, her movements steady, her expression composed. Because some decisions are not made in moments of attention. They are made in silence. And somewhere between a corrected line and a quiet room, both she and Daniel had stepped into something neither of them could ignore. The lunch rush arrived in waves, not chaotic, but steady, the kind of movement that filled the restaurant with a quiet urgency, plates sliding across polished surfaces, conversations blending into a low, constant hum. Clara moved through it all with the same controlled rhythm, her steps measured, her attention divided but never scattered. She carried 2 trays at once, balanced with precision, adjusting her grip without looking, her mind tracking orders, timing, details that most would miss. Nothing about her suggested distraction. And yet, something beneath the surface had shifted. Near the front, the door opened again, a subtle change in air pressure that most would not notice. Clara did not look up immediately. She finished setting down a glass, aligned it with the edge of the table, then turned. Daniel Whitmore stood just inside the entrance, not accompanied, not announced. His presence did not interrupt the room the way it had the night before. It did something quieter. It drew attention without demanding it. A few heads turned. Staff straightened slightly. But Clara simply observed him for a fraction of a second, then continued walking toward him as if he were any other guest. Table for one? She asked, her tone even, professional, untouched by familiarity. Daniel gave a small nod. If you have space. There was no assumption in his voice this time. No expectation. Clara glanced briefly across the room, calculating without hesitation. Follow me. She led him to a table near the window, not the center, not the most visible position, but one with light, with space, with a clear view of the room without being the focus of it. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. He sat without comment, placing his phone face down on the table, something he rarely did. Clara handed him the menu, though they both understood it was more form than necessity. I will give you a moment, she said, already turning slightly. Clara, he said, not loudly, but enough to pause her movement. She stopped, looking back at him, her expression unchanged. Yes. There was no title this time. No distance. Just a name. Daniel studied her briefly, then spoke, not as a man issuing instructions, but as someone choosing his words carefully. I came back because I do not like unresolved variables. It was the closest he would come to explaining himself directly. Clara held his gaze, then gave the smallest nod. And have you resolved it? She asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, no longer performing control, just present. Not yet, he admitted. A quiet honesty that would have surprised anyone who knew him. Clara considered that for a moment, then stepped closer, just enough to be heard without effort. Then maybe it is not a variable, she said softly. Maybe it is a decision. The words settled between them, not confrontational, not instructive, just clear. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition. He had spent years reducing uncertainty into measurable risk, into controllable outcomes. But this was not something that could be modeled or predicted. This required something else. And what would you decide? He asked. Clara did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward the rest of the room, where orders continued, where nothing had stopped for this conversation, then back at him. That depends, she said, on whether you are asking as a businessman or as a person. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Daniel did not respond right away. For the first time since he had entered, he did not have a prepared framework, a structured reply, a calculated move. He simply sat there, absorbing the question without trying to reshape it. Around them, the restaurant continued its rhythm, untouched by the quiet shift happening at a single table. Clara straightened slightly, returning to her professional distance. "Are you ready to order?" she asked. The moment closed as smoothly as it had opened. Daniel looked at the menu, then back at her, a faint, almost imperceptible change in his expression. "Yes," he said, but it was not entirely clear what he was answering. Daniel did not look at the menu again. He already knew that what he had come for could not be listed, priced, or served on a plate. Still, he followed the structure of the moment, naming a simple order, something unremarkable, something that would allow the conversation to exist without pressure. Clara noted it with a small nod, her pen moving quickly across the pad, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "I will bring it out shortly," she said, and turned away with the same quiet efficiency, leaving behind a space that felt larger than before. Daniel sat back, his gaze drifting toward the window, but not really seeing the street beyond it. The question she had placed in front of him remained, not loud, not urgent, but persistent. Businessman or person? For most of his life, the answer had been immediate. There had never been a separation. The two had been the same. But now, sitting in a place where no one was trying to impress him, where no one was measuring themselves against his position, the distinction no longer felt theoretical. It felt real. Around him, the restaurant continued its rhythm, orders called out, glasses refilled, quiet conversations unfolding in small, contained worlds that had nothing to do with him. For the first time in a long while, Daniel was not the center of anything, and he did not correct it. Clara returned a few minutes later, placing the plate in front of him with careful precision, aligning it slightly before stepping back. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone the same as it had been with every other guest. Equal. Consistent. Daniel looked at her, not at the plate, not at the room, but at her. "Sit with me for a moment," he said. It was not framed as an offer this time. Not a transaction. Just a request. Clara paused. Not surprised. Not uncomfortable. Just considering. The room moved around them, unchanged, unaware of the quiet decision being made at a single table. Then she pulled the empty chair across from him and sat, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap, not as a server stepping out of role, but as a person choosing to stay. Daniel noticed the difference immediately. There was no performance in it. No shift in identity. She had not become someone else. She had simply allowed a different context. "As a person," he said after a brief moment, answering the question she had asked earlier. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Clara watched him, her expression calm, but attentive in a way that acknowledged the shift. "Then you already know the answer," she replied. Daniel exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in recognition. He had spent years asking the right questions, extracting the right information, controlling outcomes through precision. But this was not about information. It was about clarity. "You are not supposed to be here," he said, not as a judgment, but as an observation that had finally reached its full form. Clara's gaze did not waver. "And yet, I am," she said. No defense, no explanation, just truth. Daniel almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was undeniable. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, not for secrecy, but for focus. "Come work with me," he said. This time, there was no condition attached. No negotiation. No framing. Just an offer. Clara did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, the way she had let everything else settle, without rushing to fill the space. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out the card he had given her the night before. She placed it gently on the table between them, not sliding it back, not rejecting it, just setting it where both of them could see it. "You already gave me the opportunity," she said. Daniel's eyes moved to the card, then back to her, waiting. Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression softening just enough to reveal something deeper than before. "The question is not whether I can work with you," she continued. "It is whether I need to." The words were not dismissive. They were precise. Daniel held her gaze, and for a moment, the answer he had expected dissolved. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Power had always meant access, control, the ability to open doors others could not. But sitting across from her, he understood something else. Some people do not wait for doors. They decide whether they want to walk through them at all. He leaned back slowly, the realization settling into place without resistance. Then he gave a small nod, not as a concession, but as respect. Fair, he said quietly. Clara stood, the moment closing as naturally as it had opened. Enjoy your meal, she said, returning to her role without losing herself in it. Daniel watched. Her walk away, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to follow, to question, to control. He simply sat there, in a room that no longer felt like a stage, holding on to a truth that had not been negotiated, not been bought, not been offered. It had simply been shown. And in the quiet that followed, one thing became clear. She had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard.